Welcome everybody and good morning, and once again, can we pull up the presentation maybe? Yeah, okay, great. I think we are almost 25 minutes late. I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. But yeah, see, I've been associated with Huddle for a while, so it's always good to come back, and as someone who hails from the state of Kerala, it's always good to come back and see the progress that's happening year on year in India, in Kerala. So extremely happy to be here and thankful that Kerala Startup Mission has had me here. I've been tasked with speaking on something slightly technical, I would say. So I wanted to bring the concept of the Indian carbon markets in front of you, and let me thank all of you also for being here. It's almost the first event of the Sustainability Zone, and I hope I'm able to do justice to the topic that has been given to me. So let me start. Before we start with carbon credits, I think it's fundamental for us to understand what is GHG, right? What is greenhouse emission gases? As you all know, greenhouse emission gases are gases that basically hold back heat, or that trap the heat in the atmosphere. And I think we have just done justice. The ACs have also gone off. So that is basically also giving us an effect of a greenhouse gas here. But essentially there are 4 classifications that is considered within greenhouse gases, right? There is carbon dioxide, there is methane, there is nitrous oxide, and there is fluorinated gases. So I just wanted to introduce GHGs first before I move into carbon credits and subsequent things, because it is fundamental. I will keep referring to all of these gases as I speak ahead in my presentation. Just to give you a sense of what is the overview of greenhouse gases, I've just used US data because this was what was readily available. In 2022, the US emission standards basically said that 79.7, which is almost 80% of their emissions, was CO2, 11% was methane, 6% was nitrous oxide, and 3.1% was fluoride gases. Now, that's the interesting thing, right? It is 3.1% of fluorinated gases. But is that a small thing? No. And that's where global warming potential comes in. So the UN IPCC, basically Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, basically came up with a standard to measure what is the impact that these greenhouse gases can have on you or have on the atmosphere, right? And that is where they created this measure called as global warming potential. Now, what is GWP? GWP is actually a measure. And what is that? It is a measure of how much of energy the emission of 1 ton of gas will absorb over a given period of time, keeping carbon dioxide as a base. So the fundamental idea is that you're using carbon dioxide as your base measure, and then you're measuring all the gases against that, and how much of energy is needed to actually generate that gas or absorb that gas from the atmosphere. And this is where things get interesting, right? So it's considered over a 100-year period of time. So they basically say that, okay, over a 100-year period of time, the amount of energy units that is needed for absorption of CO2 is 1. That is a base estimate that they use. Now let's look at methane. Methane is something that comes essentially from biomass, essentially from agri practices, so on and so forth. It's around 28. And what is a lifetime in atmosphere? There is another factor that they consider called as lifetime in atmosphere. This is basically the amount of years that you actually need to break down 1 unit of that gas. For methane, it is 12 years. Now let's consider nitrous oxide. The GWP is 265 times of carbon, which is carbon dioxide. And what is the atmospheric lifespan? 114 years. Now we come to fluorinated gases, essentially the gases that come out from industrial practices, our ACs, so on and so forth. The GWP is almost 11,000 to 23,500 times of what carbon dioxide does. And what is a lifetime in the atmosphere? To break down 1, it can vary from 27 to 3,200 years. So that's the impact that we are working with, right? That is the kind of impact that we are working with when we are looking at the 1.5 degrees Celsius reduction that we have kept for ourselves. Now that brings us to why do we need carbon credits, right? And what is carbon credits? So there is a standard definition that we have for carbon credits. And this is essentially that it is 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide or an equivalent greenhouse gas that is reduced, sequestrated, or avoided. That is 1 carbon credit. This is a standard measure that the IPCC has come out as part of the Kyoto Protocol, where the idea being that we want to incentivize people working in some of these hard sectors. So for example, cement sector, energy sector, which are some of the high utilization sectors for GHG emissions. They wanted to give some incentive for them to look at how to reduce this. So bring about some matrices around that, bring about some incentives. And that was essentially the start of carbon credit systems across the globe. And like I said, it started in the 1997 agreement known as the Kyoto Protocol. And from there have been multiple iterations, right? So the idea being that there should be an energy market where you are able to say that, okay, India has such generated X amount of carbon credits, and we want to offset this, or we want to sell this to someone who has reduced, who has sold, or who has produced more carbon. Vice versa, a country like US, which is one of the largest producers, or China, one of the largest producers of GHG today, they would want to buy carbon credits to kind of like offset some of the generation that they have done. All of this was initially mandated by something called as ERPA, which is the Emission Reduction Purchase Agreements, again mandated under the Kyoto Protocol. This subsequently evolved. Then something came up called as the Clean Development Mechanism, where the entire idea was that each country decides what is needed for them. They devises mechanisms so that they also know what is the development that they're doing, how clean that they can make, so on and so forth. This all culminated into the entire Paris Agreement, where all of you would have also heard about the 1.5 degrees Celsius commitment that almost 190 countries signed upon. And this is how, and that is a Paris Agreement which is currently in practice, and which was also recently discussed in the COP that was happening in Baku in Azerbaijan. So this happened in Paris. Now let's try to make it a slightly more engaging thing, right? So I told you what is carbon credit. I told you how the countries are generating carbon, so on and so forth. But I just thought, let me take my own example, right? Just to see how much of carbon am I producing. I have a small link, which is a UN link, essentially. Let me see if I can pull that up. Yeah, there it is. What I'll try to do is to give you an estimate of the annual carbon emission that I have. So this is a link that UN has. Danesh, can I use that mic, I think? Hello, can you all hear me? Yeah, this is slightly better. So what I'm trying to do is, I'm just taking my lifestyle and then trying to give you what is the carbon emission that I do in a year, so that all of you get an idea, right? And this is something that is there on the United Nations carbon offset platform, which will basically give you an estimate of how things are. And I would urge all of you to give it a thought, because the results can be quite surprising for all of us. So basically, essentially, they are asking a few questions. Let me try to enter them. So they have asked about my household. My household is 4. I have a wife and 2 kids. They have asked me my country of residence. Let me. Okay. I put my country of residence as India. They have asked the size of my apartment. It's in square meters. My house should be roughly around 1,600 square foot, so I'm putting it as 160. What is the type of household? I live in an apartment, so I put it as flat. What is the energy consumption? I think it should be in the range of 170 units per year, per month. Clean energy source, I live in Bangalore. I think it's roughly around 10% is what comes from clean energy source. Heating source, we don't obviously need heating, so it is no heating. I'm going to the next. It is going to ask me how I travel around, right? I mostly travel in a car, but I do some cycling also, so maybe I'll put around 8 hours in a week. I do use a car. It's asking me what car is it. I'm speaking on carbon credits and I use a diesel car. What is my annual mileage? I have quite a lot of running, so it's roughly around 20,000 kilometers. Average consumption, I'm assuming I get around 14 to 15 kilometers a liter. So I'm going to put it at 6. I don't use a motorbike. Private flights, it asks me how many flights I take. I think roughly maybe around, thankfully I don't do long range flights. In fact, I got a flight to come into Trivandrum to speak about carbon credits also. So let's say short range, roughly around 12 flights a year. What is my food? I say meat in some meals. Sometimes, not always. Again, sometimes. Weekends, so maybe let's put it 2. Thankfully, we have a very efficient recycling system in our apartment, so that helps me offset a bit. So, yeah. Let's see how much I am generating in a year. Okay. That is 28.44 tons of CO2. That is my total annual emission. Imagine, that's from a household of 4 people. What is the India country average? It is 6.92. I'm almost 4 times of what a normal person does in India. What is the world average? 18.68. So see, this is the impact that we create, right? This is the impact that we create by generating carbon across. So now let me try to come back to my deck. Sorry, there is an extended screen, so I'm just trying to find where my cursor is. Okay, so that's where I wanted to show what is the impact that we are creating on the ground, right? The kind of carbon emissions that we do. But all of you would have also heard this other term called carbon offset. I also wanted to bring some clarity around what is carbon credit and what is carbon offset, right? Carbon credit is basically a mechanism to incentivize people, right? So you want to limit emissions using carbon credits. But what is carbon offset? Carbon offset is how you do it. Basically, you offset it by doing some projects. That is what is carbon offset. So like I said, carbon credit is where you create carbon credits generated by projects that reduce or avoid, and carbon offset is actually the method of doing it. I just wanted to bring in this clarity before I actually move on to the actual Indian carbon markets and the carbon market overall. Just wanted to give you an overview of what is there in the global carbon credit market also. Right? So you have domestic, there is a domestic compliance market and there is a domestic voluntary market, which is the crediting mechanism. I've also tried to see where there is a demand and the credit supply also. And if you see, there is this voluntary market and there is a compliance market. I'll go into much more detail into all of this, taking the Indian context so that all of you get an idea of what are the policies, etc. in India. Domestic compliances, there are energy trading systems, there are carbon taxes, there are some domestic crediting mechanisms, etc., so on and so forth. But again, to move on to essence of what is there, let's come into the Indian carbon market, right? Just to give you an example, you saw how much of carbon that I generate, right? Now let's look at what India has generated over the last 1 year. So as of October end 2024, India produced 2.9 billion metric tons of carbon. That is, India as a single nation has generated 2.9 billion metric tons of carbon. This is projected to increase 30%, 35% by 2050. One of the major contributors is the power generation sector, which has done roughly around 1.4 gigatons of carbon emission. But at the same time, India is also one of the largest producers of carbon credits. We have 278 million credits in the voluntary carbon market between 2010 and 2022. This was the data that was available. This accounts for around 70% of the global supply that is there across the globe. Now this brings us to what should we do to essentially handle the entire carbon market, right? So recently the government came up with a framework called as ICM. This framework is the Indian Carbon Market Framework, where the idea is that for us to achieve the nationally determined contribution target, again, as part of the Paris Agreements, all the 190 states that basically signed on to the Paris Agreement committed themselves to nationally determined contribution, which is basically reductions or mechanisms or methods that they have adopted to reduce carbon emission as well as create platforms for carbon offsetting. We created the Indian carbon market. It is called as the ICM framework. Under the ICM framework, the government has today gazetted something called as a CCTS, which is a carbon credit trading system. This has been notified in June 2023. Various iterations have been happening on the draft. It is hoped that the expected rollout maybe roughly around 25-26, end of 25, Q1 26 is when they expect the actual CCTS system to roll out. And this is only for the mandated part. This is only for the obligated system. We still, our frameworks for voluntary mechanisms is still evolving. We do not have one. And like I said, two mechanisms, which is compliance and voluntary. I will go into some detail into CCTS, which is what is basically proposed to be the standard across the Indian carbon credit markets. But we have to also look at what has been the history for India, right? What has been the various mechanisms that we have followed. So we had something called as PAT, which is the Perform, Achieve, Trade scheme. The idea behind PAT was that you voluntarily asked organizations, large industry to come up with some targets that they would want to achieve. And it was a market-based mechanism where they could essentially trade those credits that they were able to save. Under the PAT mechanism, they had basically issued something called as e-certs. It is called as energy saving certificates. And this was basically being managed by the Bureau of Energy Efficiency under the National Mission of Energy Efficiency. So this was basically the compliance mechanism that we had in India, and it was fairly successful, I would say. We created two exchanges, the India Energy Exchange as well as the Power Exchange India Limited, which basically used to handle the entire PAT system, trading of credits there, so on and so forth. And PAT covered roughly around 13 sectors, which was thermal power plants, cement, aluminum, iron and steel, pulp and paper, fertilizer, petroleum refineries, chemicals, chlor-alkali, petrochemicals, distribution companies, so on and so forth. So this was the first attempt, PAT was the first attempt India made towards a credit trading system or a carbon credit market. This also led to another system called as a renewable energy certificate system, where the entire idea was that there you were looking at emission, you're also looking at generation. The entire idea being, if you are an industry, if you are consuming power, can you look at it from a energy efficient source? And that was the renewable energy certificate system. And how did the system work? Essentially, we had the power pool where energy was getting generated, and it was given as 1 megawatt hour was considered as 1 REC. So for example, if you're a large industry, if you're consuming 1 megawatt hour from a renewable energy source, then you are given a renewable energy certificate. So if you are within the limit, then you are able to trade it. If you are beyond the limit, you have to basically buy REC certificates from people. Again, this was issued by the Central Electricity Regulator, again under the National Load Dispatch Center mechanism. So these were some of the historical attempts that India as a nation made on the carbon credit trading system. Now coming back to the CCTS system that I noted, right, that I mentioned, which the government is actively propagating as India's answer to the CCTS system. I took the liberty of reading the gazette that the government had put out with regards to CCTS. I tried to simplify that into an entire flowchart on how the entire compliance mechanism for CCTS works, so that I am also able to communicate to you. At the central of the entire CCTS system, which is a market-based mechanism to reduce greenhouse gases by incentivizing industries or sectors, is the Ministry of Power. What the Ministry of Power needs to do is, it needs to identify the sectors and obligated entities. Now what are obligated entities? Obligated entities are entities which are mandated to reduce carbon emission or mandated to reduce GHG emissions. And how do they do that? They essentially do that on inputs from Bureau of Energy Efficiency, as well as a steering committee that has been formulated called the National Steering Committee for Indian Carbon Market. Now what are the responsibilities of the steering committee, right? The steering committee essentially has 3 responsibilities. Okay. Thanks very much. Sorry, I have a slightly sore throat, so I will keep sipping on some water in between. It has essentially 3 responsibilities. One is governance, oversight and functioning. And what is the constitution of the National Steering Committee on this? It is chaired by the Secretary, Ministry of Power, and co-chaired by the Secretary, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. There are representatives from various relevant government departments as the government moves it to mirror. Okay, now first they identify the sectors and they identify the obligated entities, right? Now once they identify this, they have to then develop a target, right? This is called as a transition target. They need to develop a target. Who does this? The Bureau of Energy Efficiency does it. And again, they use the carbon credit mechanism, which is 1 ton CO2 equivalent generated. Now once they do this, the next is to notify the Ministry of Environment and Forest Change on what these emission intensity targets are. So basically they notify the Ministry of Environment and Forest, who then notifies it to the larger public under the Environment Protection Act of 1996. So essentially what has happened, first They identified the sectors, then they identified the entities. After that, they notified what are the emission targets. All of this comes under the ambit of the Environment Protection Act. Because in India as a country, you cannot notify something without it coming under an act of the Parliament. It comes under the act of the Environment Protection Act of 1986. Now you have notified, you know what are the targets. What do you do next? All the obligated entities now need to start a monitoring and verification process. How do they do that? The first step of monitoring and verification is to set a gate-to-gate boundary. Now this is an interesting concept, right? What is a gate-to-gate boundary? A gate-to-gate boundary means, say for example, I am a cement industry for that matter. My gate-to-gate boundary means all the inputs that come to my gate, all the energy consumed for the inputs that come to my gate, as well as all the processes that happen within my premises. So that is gate 1, where all your inputs are coming in, where all your energy is getting consumed for the inputs are coming in, which is extraction of chemicals, the transportation of the chemicals, transportation of raw materials, so on and so forth. And then all the processes, the process of converting your raw materials into the end cement or the end concrete, that is your gate-to-gate definition. Now once you define your gate-to-gate boundary, this is considered fixed for the period of monitoring of your credit generation. If you have to make any change, say for example, I expanded my my manufacturing plant. So today I had a 20-acre manufacturing unit. Tomorrow I expanded it to say a 50-acre manufacturing unit. I need to expand, or I need to inform the BEE on that this is the expansion that has happened. Otherwise, any credit saving or any carbon saving that you have done in the additionally sanctioned area will not be considered as part of your carbon credit offset. Now you set your gate-to-gate boundary. The next is where you actually develop a monitoring plan. What is needed for a monitoring plan, right? So you need to do essentially 3 things, which is description of activities. Basically you need to highlight all the emission sources, source streams, metering points, metering equipments, etc. You need to have a monitoring methodology that is needed. You need to have a written procedure of data that is needed. And you need to have sampling and testing procedures. This is essentially where you have your entire monitoring plan that is developed. Once you develop your monitoring plan, the next is where you monitor and verify the systems. Again, you need to submit your plan within 3 months of where you say that you're actually going into a carbon credit monitoring system. You need to keep submitting your plans annually every 3 months. You need to review and keep them updated every year. There are 2 types of monitoring that you can do. One is a continuous monitoring, the other is an aggregated monitoring that you do. Continuous monitoring is where you keep measuring your emissions continuously. Aggregated monitoring is where you say that, okay, my measurement will be done every quarter, or my measurement will be done every 6 months. Once you monitor and verify, the next is the issuance of carbon credit certificates, right? Basically the BE appoints accredited verifiers. Once these verifiers give inputs to the BE saying that, okay, this industry has basically set this target and they have achieved the target, the BE go ahead and then issues the carbon credits to the organization. Now, how do they issue it? They issue it on the basis of either the overachievement that has happened or the underachievement that has happened. We will look at how that also happens. And finally, once a credit has been issued, the next is where you are able to trade these credits, right? Just to give you a sense of how this entire thing works, right? So let me take the example of a cement industry. I say that, okay, I need 1 ton carbon emission to produce 2 tons of cement or 2 tons of concrete. So that is a scenario. So I've set a baseline here saying that my base GHG emission is 1 ton CO2e for 2 tons of cement produced. We set that guideline saying that, okay, you have to save 0.5. Basically, what we are saying is that you will have to make your systems more efficient so that we are able to produce 1 ton or 2 ton concrete with 0.5 ton CO2. That is where we set the emission target. Now it starts operating. This is the obligated entity. This is how they proceed. Now what happens? Essentially, if they are able to achieve it within that, if they are able to achieve it within the yellow part basically says that this is how much I have credited. So in this case, let's say their obligation was 0.5 ton, but they were able to do it in 0.3 ton. That means there is 0.2 tons that they can basically get a carbon credit system issue or a carbon credit certificate issue. If that's not the case, if they do not achieve the target, then that means it is a negative for them. Now let's consider the scenario where they have zero point 0.2 ton carbon credit certificate issued to them. What do? They have an opportunity to sell this carbon credit system, right? So here there is an obligated entity A, which is basically saved on the carbon credit targets that were set to them, and we have an obligated entity B, which is overspent on the carbon credit system that was given to them. They were supposed to do it in 0.5, but they did it in 0.7. These guys were supposed to do it in 0.5, but they did it in 0.3. That gives us an opportunity to trade in the power exchange, which is here. There could also be a scenario that a lot of entities generated savings, right? Now what do? Obligated entity A could decide that, okay, this year I was able to save, but maybe next year I might not be able to save. So they have also an opportunity to bank the carbon credit certificates that is given to them, where they are saying that, okay, I might not have utilized the full credits given to me this year, but there is a possibility that I might need more additional generation in the next year. So they have an opportunity to bank. Now there is also one more scenario where there is an entity who has not achieved the credit targets that are given to them, and there is nothing available in the market for them to buy. What do? There is a penalty associated with that. So that's the post-compliance part of it. So if you look at it, this is the pre-compliance, this is the exchange, and that's a post-compliance. So this is how the entire trading in the carbon credit market works, right? I spoke about power exchanges. So there are basically 3 power exchanges that are there in India. One is called as the India Energy Exchange, the other is called as the Power Exchange India Limited, and the third is the Hindustan Power Exchange Limited. These are all entities where multiple parties have come together. So I think the closest example that I can think about is commodities trading. A lot of you would have heard of how commodities trading happens, right? So there's petroleum trading, spices trading, so on and so forth. This is something similar. So this is where the energy credit systems get traded in India as a country today. Now, what are the challenges in the Indian carbon market, right? So I spoke very eloquently on what is the process, why this is good for India as a country, so on and so forth. But is this a foolproof mechanism? I still doubt. There are a lot of challenges that we see when we come to carbon trading systems, right? One is generating demand. So initially, the idea was that the government will have something called as a cap and trade system, where they say that the obligated entity will need to generate X amount of carbon credits. And the possibility is that a lot of companies might find this very attractive, that they might go ahead and say that, okay, we will save enough carbon, or we will save, or we will generate enough carbon credits. Now what will this create? This will create an oversupply of carbon credits, right? There might be a large number of entities who are generating carbon credits, but there aren't enough number of entities who can basically absorb these carbon credits. Now that supply-demand gap is a big problem, and this is something that the government has experienced in its previous initiative with the PAT system. I spoke about the PAT system. What happened in the PAT system was that the energy saving certificates, the ESCerts that they had basically issued, the prices crashed massively. The reason being there was a massive supply-demand gap. And then the government had to step in and then basically set a base price for the ESCert, saying that, okay, this is the standard price that we will trade a basic ESCert. This killed the entire objective of having a trading system, right? Because the generation, the supply, the demand was not a market traded system. The second is fixing the emission limits. I spoke about how 13 sectors were covered under the PAT system, and the government recently notified the CCTS system. And if you also remember the infographic that I put up, the power generation sector contributes almost half of India's emission. But do you know what is surprising? The power generation sector is not considered under the CCTS system. So there are no obligated mandates on the power generation sector towards carbon credit saving. So that's fundamentally a misnomer, right? As in, how can you fix emission limits if one of your largest sectors of carbon generation or GHG emission is not under the scheme? The third is how the compliance market interacts with the voluntary market. There is a very active voluntary market today with regards to carbon credit trading system. I will also come to voluntary markets, a couple of slides to give you a flavor. But what is happening is, because the compliance market is heavily regulated and managed by the government, they do not interact very easily with the voluntary market. So that becomes another challenge, because again, because of market forces, if the voluntary trading market has lesser carbon, or the cost of carbon credits is lesser there, someone might decide to go and buy it from you, right? And the government might not be able to mandate that. The other thing is the regulatory changes. This is a sector that is constantly evolving. And so I'm fairly certain all of you would have started hearing about carbon credits maybe 7-8 years back. And people are still understanding. So it's like human evolution. This entire sector is just evolving, and people are understanding what are the pitfalls, what are the challenges, what more can be done, what less needs to be done. So that regulatory framework is still something work in progress. And today when you say, okay, we have a CCTS systems with XYZ, in 6 months down the lane, if that XYZ moves, then people who would have managed to build systems around the existing regulatory systems will have a challenge. And then what is the need for creating a strong monitoring and compliance mechanism? That is another challenge that is there with the Indian carbon market. But let me not leave you only with the challenges, right? There are also opportunities that is there. India as a nation has a commitment to be a net zero country by 2070. That is a huge opportunity for us from a carbon credit market system or a CCTS system. We had a patch system, we had a REC system earlier, and this gives some experience for the industries today to get into a CCTS system easily, right? Because they know how carbon credits are traded, they know what are the exchanges that are available today, they know what are the vagaries of the cost, they know what are the potential fluctuations, they know how an activity monitoring system needs to be developed, they know how a verification system needs to be developed, etc. So once mandated, I think our industries are slightly ready to get into that. Another interesting factor is that from a voluntary market system, India is the second largest number of CDMs, which is a clean development mechanism projects. So Tamil Nadu is an interesting state, it's a neighboring state. You will see a large number of wind farms in Tamil Nadu. These are all CDM projects. So they have figured out that there is a voluntary mechanism through which they are able to sell the carbon credits that they have generated from the CDM projects there to a large number of European countries. So if you look at it, Scandinavia is one of the biggest regions that acquires carbon credits from India, and they all buy from a lot of these wind farms across India. And under the patch scheme, we were able to save close to 106 million tons of CO2 emissions from 2015 to 2024. While I spoke about the demand vagaries, there is still high demand of carbon in the international market from the voluntary market. Not in the obligated market, it is from the voluntary market. I will show you some demand numbers on that also in the subsequent slides. One more thing that gives India as an advantage is that, and this is very interesting because we are at Hurdle, AI and blockchain. A large number of carbon credit trading systems depend upon AI and blockchain because they need that for their monitoring and verification system, they need that for their certificate generation, so on and so forth. So India's advantage here is that we have an extremely strong, resourceful population which understands the concepts of AI and blockchain. The last is a focus that the government has because this is a massive economic generation potential. In my second slide or so, I spoke about the total carbon, voluntary carbon market generation that India has done, the carbon credits in the voluntary market that India has done, which was around 17% of the global market. In dollar terms, this translates to roughly around $200 to $300 billion. So it's a massive opportunity, right? So if you look at it, this is an opportunity that is presenting to the government to find additional funds to support our development, to find additional funds to support our economy. And especially for a state like Kerala, right? We have a massive coast. This is a massive opportunity for us. Anything that is water driven, anything that is ocean driven, anything that is sea driven is an opportunity for us to deploy a CDM project. So these are some of the market opportunities that we have. And I kept speaking about the voluntary market and how that is also driving the entire carbon credit market across the globe, right? If you look at it, these are some of the large companies which have basically signed up for the voluntary carbon credit markets. Microsoft, BP is, my personal view is that it's questionable. They're one of the largest producers also. Signify, HSBC, Interface, L'Oreal, Shell. So Shell had an important, I don't know how many of you read. Recently Shell had a case in the Netherlands Supreme Court or High Court, I don't know what is the exact term that they use, where a citizens group had filed a case against Shell saying that they need to be measuring the carbon emissions that they have and they need to be capping it. Unfortunately for us, or unfortunately for the environment, and maybe fortunately for Shell, the government threw out the case saying that you cannot mandate only a specific company to do that. If you're doing it, you need to do it at the national level. So these are all companies that have voluntarily come forward and then said that we would want to do purchase carbon credits from the voluntary market. There are other companies also that have basically committed to net zero. Some of them are heavily involved in India as a nation. Nestle, PepsiCo, Unilever, Danone, P&G, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, Bosch, so on and so forth. This is the size of the voluntary carbon market, right? So I spoke about India's carbon market, the CCTS systems that India is devising. I spoke about how that is a part of the mandated mechanisms, and this is the global carbon market potential that is there, right? So if you look at it, Delta Airlines is one of the largest buyers of VCM credits, which is a voluntary carbon market credit. And then if you look at the number of companies over the years, I don't know how visible it is, but over the years it has just been increasing. So we have almost 5,500 companies which basically committed themselves to net zero commitments and said that we want to come forward and then and contribute or buy from the carbon credit market. But again, like I said, the demand-supply vagaries keeps happening. Right? Till 2021, we saw that this was a constant uphill. It was constantly keep going up. The carbon credits being produced, the certificates being issued, the certificates being purchased, traded, etc., kept on increasing. But abruptly in 2022, that is where it came to drop. So essentially, what I was trying to communicate is that we are thinking of systems, we are thinking of mechanisms through which we are able to formalize this entire process. We see historically that there are a lot of opportunities that arise. We see historically there are a lot of progress that we have made. But can that be considered as a trend that will continue to go forward? It is something that we have to see, explore, and also evidence as it rolls out. So yeah, with that, I wanted to quickly wrap up, and I think I'm well within time. I kept a 30-minute window for myself, I'm at 26 minutes. So this was essentially what I wanted to convey to the entire Indian perspective on the carbon markets, how we as a country is looking forward to building a carbon trading system within India. What are the challenges that are there? What are the frameworks that are there? What are the institutional mechanisms involved, the organizations involved, so on and so forth. So yeah, with that, a quick thank you. Thank you for the patient listening. I hope it wasn't too academic. I tried to bring in some examples, and I hope that is something that all of you were able to relate. Yeah, and that's it.